Hello friends, my name is JJ, and in 2025, it is possible that North America will see something that it hasn't seen in almost 20 years. Right-of-center political parties in power in both Canada and the US at the same time. And since those two parties would theoretically come to power within a year of each other, this would also mean the longest period of unified conservative rule in North America in almost 40 years. Now, that idea might excite you, or it might frighten you. It is certainly frightening to the two incumbent progressive administrations in the US and Canada, who are both facing an uphill battle for re-election at the moment. Both President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau have faced some pretty serious questions about their political competence over the last 2 weeks, with progressive activists on both sides of the border starting to contemplate some pretty dramatic solutions to what is seen to be a uniquely dire political moment. And because we love to talk about US-Canada stuff on this channel, I thought this would be a great topic for a video this week. A video that I like to call the Summer of Crisis, starring Justin Trudeau and Joe Biden. So in some ways, Joe Biden and Justin Trudeau don't have a lot in common. They have a huge age gap, they've had very different political careers, and their personalities and public brands are quite distinct. But in other ways, there is a lot of overlap. They are both leaders of their country's main progressive parties. They are both seen as relatively establishment political figures, standing against the forces of the populist right and left alike. And they both came to power in somewhat unusual circumstances. Justin Trudeau is the eldest son of former Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, one of Canada's longest-serving and most consequential leaders, and for that reason, Justin had long been considered a possible heir to his father's political dynasty someday. But that said, for a long time, the younger Trudeau was not seen as taking his political pedigree very seriously. As a young man, he lacked the intellectual vigor and curiosity of his father, struggling to graduate from college and working as a ski instructor and substitute drama teacher rather than something more substantial. And when he finally did enter politics as a backbench member of parliament, critics dismissed him as an underachieving Nepo baby. But then in the 2010s, the party of the Trudeaus, the Canadian Liberals, were nearly decimated in the 2011 Canadian general election. For the first time in Canadian history, this once mighty party was relegated to third place. If the Liberals were to have any hope at all for a comeback in 2015, they would need a truly game-changing prime ministerial candidate. And it was in this desperate context that the party turned to the now 44-year-old Justin Trudeau. And it was a big gamble. Justin was seen as immature and inexperienced with a weak grasp on policy, but he did wind up rising to the occasion in other ways. He was very charismatic and charming, very skilled at emotional appeals and empathy. In contrast to his conservative opponents, he was very skilled at articulating an optimistic, patriotic vision for the future of Canada, even if it was low on specifics. And thus, in 2015, he got elected Prime Minister. A man who would have probably never been considered for the country's top job in a different timeline, but he wound up getting it in ours because his party was willing to take a chance in a dark moment. And I think it is easy to see some parallels here with Joe Biden. Biden was elected to the US Senate in the early 1970s and began dreaming of a run for the presidency not long after. But he was never a very popular national politician and failed to rally other Democrats behind him. Whenever he made a formal attempt to run, his candidacies were brief and embarrassing flops.
I'd like you to look me over. You have a right to know a lot more about me than you know now, which is probably little to nothing.
But then in 2008, a much more successful presidential candidate, Barack Obama, picked Biden to be his vice presidential running mate. It was a decision greeted with a bit of skepticism by some pundits at the time. Senator Biden, after all, was a boring white guy in his late 60s from a safe Democratic state and clearly not all that popular. He seemed to offer very little strategic benefit to the Obama campaign, but Obama trusted Biden's wisdom and experience, and his decision to make him vice president helped set in motion the sequence sequence of events that led us to where we are today. After taking a pass on the 2016 presidential race, Biden was one of many Democrats who chose to run against President Trump in 2020. Democrats saw Trump as a uniquely dangerous and destructive president, so the stakes of picking the right candidate to run against him were very high. And in this context, some of Biden's earlier problems as a politician now made him look freshly attractive. Once scorned as an elderly, boring figure of the Washington political establishment, in the context of a race against Trump, Biden became seen as safe, moderate, experienced, and inoffensive.
But you have my back, and I promise I'll have yours.
And that apparently was just what voters were looking for. All right, and now let us talk about how the happy lives of these two men have recently taken a turn for the worse. Prime Minister Trudeau was re-elected twice, but his popularity has been on a pretty steady downfall since winning his third term in 2021. The Canadian economy has struggled badly in the aftermath of COVID, and Trudeau has taken a lot of the blame for the country's high rate of unemployment, inflation, and cost of living in general. There's also a sense that after 9 years in power, Canadians are just sort of blandly sick of him. He is a man who has a personality that tends to grate after a while. I always remember that somebody once told me that Trudeau's lighthearted style is that of a guy forever skating on the line between laughing with and laughing at. And I would say that he is now firmly on the wrong side of that balancing act. The fact that this clip of him dancing recently went viral for all of the wrong reasons is a good example. Now, while Trudeau has been consistently down in the polls for a while now, until 2 weeks ago, no one quite knew just how unpopular he truly was. On June 24th, there was a special parliamentary election in Toronto to pick a replacement for a longtime Trudeau loyalist who the Prime Minister had recently appointed ambassador to Denmark. Toronto is considered like super duper safe territory for the Liberals, as urban centers usually are for progressive parties. But the Liberals wound up losing the special election to the Conservative Party in a major upset, and this triggered a huge panic.
This is a stunning result.
This is a huge upset for the Liberals.
It's hard, Todd, to overstate the significance of the message that this sends the Liberals.
If the Conservatives could win in Toronto, flipping a seat that the Liberals had held for over 30 years, then the thinking went that there were basically no safe Liberal seats anywhere in the country. This raised the possibility that in next year's general election, the Liberals could face a wipeout of truly epic proportions, perhaps something akin to what the Conservatives in Britain just went through. A few days later, Democrats in the US faced an equally rude wake-up call of their own when President Biden faced off against former President Trump in their first televised debate since 2020. Trump's attempt at a political comeback has been going a lot better than many expected, with the two presidents running neck and neck. Both candidates thus needed to put on an impressive show at the debate, but Biden's performance was considered shockingly bad, even to a lot of Democrats. Biden is 81 years old, the oldest president ever, and even he will admit to fading a bit with age. But when he took the debate stage on June 27th, he looked truly pathetically doddering and feeble at a time when his party is trying to aggressively remind the public why they shouldn't give Trump a second chance. Biden came off as a man who could barely remember anything at all.
With the COVID, with dealing with everything we have to do with, look, if we finally beat Medicare.
When you read the papers in Canada or the US these days, especially the analysis of some of the more liberal commentators, the defining debate in both countries is whether the top guy should stay or go. In order to salvage an election, the progressive parties are now clearly losing. The freakout is more severe in the US because Donald Trump is seen as a much more dangerous man than the Canadian Conservative Party leader, Pierre Poilievre. But a lot of Canadian Liberals still view Poilievre as this very right-wing figure who could dramatically change Canada if given unchecked power. Canada's next election also isn't until October of 2025, more than a year from now, which gives the Liberal Party a bit more breathing room to ponder its options. And what options are those? So, it is not uncommon in Canada for prime ministers to abruptly resign in office rather than face looming defeat at the ballot box. This then allows their parties the opportunity to install a new prime minister who can serve in office for a few months and hopefully put a new, more attractive face on the incumbent party. This most recently happened in 2003 when Liberal Prime Minister Jean Chrétien resigned, allowing his party to make former Finance Minister Paul Martin the new Prime Minister. Martin served for 6 months, then proceeded to lead the Liberals to a narrow re-election that they probably would not have been able to win under Chrétien. The problem for today's Liberals, however, is that there are just as many historic counterexamples in which this one weird trick has not worked. Two other recent Canadian Prime Ministers, Brian Mulroney and the old man Trudeau, also both resigned when their poll numbers looked dire. But in those cases, the guys who wound up replacing them still proceeded to lose the next election in a giant landslide. Part of this is because voters are very aware of the political scheming that is going on in these sorts of situations and don't always react well to it. A political party that abruptly installs a new prime minister that nobody voted for can seem like it's playing games with the country's top job and abusing their control of the government for cynical, partisan purposes. Kim Campbell, in particular, who served as Prime Minister for just 4 months after Brian Mulroney resigned, is now widely regarded as a woman whose prime ministership made a joke of the office and helped cause her party to lose even bigger than it might have under Mulroney, as we learned from my award-winning video on the matter. It's also the case that Paul Martin was a uniquely popular and well-known member of the Chrétien administration, so he was a successor that some people were actually excited to see take over. There are no comparable stars in Justin Trudeau's cabinet, by contrast. The current Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, is often considered Trudeau's second in command, but she is not regarded as a great political talent, and it's not obvious that she could do a better job leading the Liberals into the next election than Trudeau himself could. Trudeau's other cabinet ministers are mostly unknown to the public, in large part because Trudeau himself has been such a domineering personality in Canadian politics over the last decade, which was obviously a great asset at one time, but now the Liberal Party is very much dying by that same sword. The Democrats in America face a very similar sort of dilemma. While no one expects Biden to resign the presidency outright, there are calls from some prominent progressive commentators, politicians, and donors for him to step down as the Democrats' presidential candidate and let his party install someone better. But because the American election is just in 4 months, skeptics of this idea are very skeptical and say it is way too risky. While in both Canada and America, there would have to be some sort of inter-party election to choose a new leader, the amount of time before the next Canadian election is seen as being long enough to paper over any divisions within the party that a leadership race might bring out. For the Democrats to have an inter-party election to pick a new candidate this late in the game, by contrast, opens the possibility of sowing a lot of division in the party with barely any time to recover. I have noticed that there is also a lot of conventional wisdom within the American political pundit class that it would be particularly divisive for the Democrats to nominate someone other than Vice President Harris to succeed Biden. This is supposedly because the Democrats rely very strongly on the votes of women and women of color, meaning it would be extremely offensive to a large chunk of the party's base to skip over her and install some lesser-known white guy. But on the other hand, there is also a lot of conventional wisdom that says Harris is this enormously divisive political figure in her own right, provoking a sort of can't win with her, can't win without her analysis paralysis. It is also the case that while changing leaders a few months before an election is somewhat common practice in Canada, this sort of thing has never been done in America in modern times. So while it might be weird and controversial to replace Trudeau at this point, replacing Biden would look far more desperate and gimmicky in an American context. Like I said, voters read the newspapers and are very much aware when a party is trying to cover up its own errors. So we're getting on a bit of a pessimistic kick here. So let us now do some steel manning of the best case scenarios for these two embattled parties. For starters, it is of course entirely possible that there is a better candidate than Biden out there, and that the culture of the Democratic Party is healthy enough to survive a new candidate getting installed in the next couple of weeks. Everybody is always talking about what short attention spans we all have these days. And I think it is very easy to imagine a scenario in which the entire dynamic of the 2024 election is changed after the Democrats appoint a younger, more charismatic and interesting candidate who completely dominates the news cycle and excites a previously bored and apathetic American public. It is also possible, however, that all of this isn't even necessary, and despite all his flaws, President Biden is already the best candidate the Democrats could want. Since a lot of the harshest analysis of the June 27th debate has been done by nervous liberals worried about Biden's vulnerabilities, there has been comparatively less public discussion about the other half of that night's story, which is how bad Trump did too. While polls do show that most debate watchers believe that Trump won the encounter, a sizable chunk believe that they both did bad, and a majority believe that both are unfit and should drop out. Trump also has very little persuasive power left at this point. Even though he is more articulate than Biden, he is also believed to be substantially more dishonest, which makes his whole communications advantage a bit of a wash. People who follow politics very closely have gotten pretty numb to Trump at this point, but to a lot of Americans, he remains this deeply repulsive figure who still has the capacity to shock and disgust. And this is worth keeping in mind as well when we consider that the big majority of Americans who say that Biden is too old to do the job and shouldn't be running is substantially larger than the number who say they are not going to vote for him. This is because people are capable of organizing their opinions into a hierarchy, and in Biden's case, a dislike for his age or feebleness is often ranked lower in importance than the need to keep him in office and Trump out. With Trudeau, the situation is a little bit tougher, just because the guy running against him isn't nearly as hated or feared as Trump and enjoys a more broad and stable coalition of supporters. Trudeau has also been in power for twice as long as Biden, and voters on this continent tend to be wary of keeping the same party in power for more than 8 years. But that said, supporters of Pierre Poilievre also have to remember that your average Canadian does not follow Canadian politics very closely, and a lot of voters still barely even know who Pierre is. It is quite shocking to me how often I meet well-educated, culturally literate Canadians who nevertheless have only the faintest idea of who is running against Trudeau in next year's election. And this gives the Liberal Party a lot of time to introduce Pierre to the voters, as the political marketing people like to say. For all his deficits, Trudeau is quite good at winning head-to-head matchups against rivals less famous or likable than himself. I would say he is also a politician who has proven himself to be chronically underestimated and very good at pulling surprise victories from the jaws of defeat. I mean, let's not forget he bounced back from this. The biggest externality working in Trudeau's favor, however, might be Trump himself. As I have discussed many times before, fear and hatred of the United States can be a powerful mobilizing force for the patriotic Canadian middle class. And if Trump gets reelected in November and spends the 10 months leading up to the Canadian election doing all sorts of crazy right-wing stuff, one imagines the temptation to portray Pierre Poilievre as a kind of mini-Trump would be very powerful. You know, like, we can't risk Pierre turning Canada into Donald Trump's America. That sort of thing. So in conclusion, in my expert political commentator opinion, I would give the Democrats about a 50-50 chance of winning the election under Biden, and a probably slightly higher than 50% chance if they install a candidate other than Biden. I think the Canadian Liberals, however, only have about a 30% chance of victory with Trudeau, and probably about a 20% chance of victory with somebody else. I just think the Liberals have a much thinner pool of political talent to draw from than the Democrats do, and that the Canadian tradition of making an unpopular incumbent resign the entire prime ministership instead of just the party leadership is a unique turnoff to a lot of voters who don't like unelected prime ministers. But I, of course, want to hear what you think. Independent of your own partisan biases, if you were summoned to advise these two parties, what strategic advice would you give them? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you next week.